So that's the debate, right? California entering in as a free state, giving rise to these, again, sectional tensions. Again, sectional just means tensions between the North and the South. So the position for, Congress, anyways, at least those in the South, they recognize that California is likely going to come in as a free state. And in fact, maybe this is a good kind of like review question. What made California, and if anybody knows the answer for this, what made California, or what was different with California than was the case with either Missouri or Texas? So what was different about California than was the case with Missouri and Texas? Maybe this will be a good review then. Good. It entered in the Union as a free state. Good. That is true. But why? Or maybe this is a better way of phrasing it. What problem did Northerners have in the case of Missouri and Texas that they did not have in California? So what problem did Northerners? Exactly. Good, right? That for all practical purposes, right, California did not have slaves already there when it applied for statehood. And that was a huge obstacle in Missouri. And that was a huge obstacle in Texas, right? That slaves were already in those territories by the time that they were ready to enter into the Union. And that wasn't the case in California. And for that reason, right, California came in as a free state. Now, the question is here for Southerners, right? So Southerners see this happening and they say, wait a minute. Okay, so California doesn't have any slaves. It's likely going to come in as a free state. So Southerners say, essentially, well, if California is going to be free, what can we get? In other words, Southerners will say, we're not going to let California just come in for nothing, right? We want something. Now, this was something that we talked about in a previous chapter, but one of the maybe biggest fears or largest sources of anxiety for Southern elites was this question of runaway slaves. Right? We talked about the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, and how at least the perception of the Underground Railroad was that, thousands of slaves are escaping every month and that something needs to be done about it. In fact, way back at the Constitutional Convention, northern states had essentially agreed to return runaways. They were no longer doing that anymore because the tensions had gotten so high. And so that's what Southerners really looked to do. And it's up to Stephen Douglas, who you see pictured right here, who becomes, in the years leading up to the Civil War, maybe the most important political figure in the United States. So this argument, again, is all over California coming in as a free state. Southerners want something in exchange for that. Whereas before, Henry Clay, again, remember, Henry Clay historically was always the great compromiser. Even Henry Clay can't figure anything out on this. Instead, it's Stephen Douglas who finds a compromise. Stephen Douglas, we're going to call him he is a Northern Democrat. He is the compromise. We'll call him the compromise politician. And really what he champions is this idea of popular sovereignty. Right? And popular sovereignty, if you remember, is the ability for states themselves to vote on the legality of slavery. And so Stephen Douglas does what essentially was the impossible, and that was to figure out a compromise over California, which eventually becomes the Compromise of 1850, right? So there are 5 different provisions. And you can already see in this case how much more difficult it is. I mean, when we look back at the Missouri Compromise, it was relatively straightforward, right? Missouri is a slave state, Maine's a free state, and a line is drawn, and that's it, right? 3 conditions. Here there are going to be 5, and it's probably going to be good to know what they are at the very least, to know what the major provisions are. Let's see if I can recall all of them. So, of course, the first provision of the compromise is that California is a free state. Again, this was what all the hoopla was about to begin with, right? But like we said, Southerners aren't going to let that happen for free. So the second part of this is a new fugitive slave law. In other words, a new law to do something about runaway slaves. We'll talk about what exactly that is down here in a second, right? But that's what the South gets. Again, really the South, their anxiety was over runaway slaves, the refusal by northern states to return them, and something needed to be done about it. And, during this compromise, things got, especially heated. You had figures like, John C. Calhoun, who had long been a politician for the pro-slavery South. He's really reaching his, I think even at this one, the Compromise of 1850, I don't even think John C. Calhoun could even attend. I think he had people read his arguments for him because he was so old at this point. But you're seeing this kind of previous generation of leadership, your Henry Clays, your Calhouns, they're kind of, they're sort of taking a back seat here. The Southerners demanded a new fugitive slave law, and they got it. But even that wasn't good enough. There had to be other conditions of the compromise here. The slave trade banned with 2 N's? Who knows? In Washington, D.C. Remember, Washington, D.C. was where Congress was held. There were Northerners who absolutely objected to the idea that they would have to go to D.C. to work, and they could witness what they witnessed the immorality of slavery firsthand. Northerners wanted that to be settled. Number 4, a Texas / New Mexico. Oops. I should do this. New Mexico border dispute. Or we'll just say border settled. Right? And then the last part of the compromise was in Utah and New Mexico. Popular sovereignty. All right. So those things, right? Those are the 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850, and Stephen Douglas had to work tirelessly to get all members of Congress on board with this, right? Again, it was considered to be an impossible task. And for doing this, Stephen Douglas was hailed as, like the savior of the nation. He was really celebrated for having saved the United States from potentially, breaking apart. However, as we'll see, there is one part of this that ends up being a very big problem. That's the new fugitive slave law. But let's go ahead and look at the map and see why the Compromise of 1850 was so celebrated. Again, the whole crisis was sparked off by the fact that California was ready to enter into the Union. So as we can see from this map, green being the free states, orange being the slave states, that California entered in as a free state, right? The rest of this territory here, Utah and New Mexico, right? That would be left up to popular sovereignty, meaning that when those territories had enough people to apply for statehood, the people could vote as to whether or not slavery would be legal there. And this was really kind of where the compromise was something that both North and South, or at least this part of it, the North and South could agree upon it. Because think of it this way. If you're in the North, right, you look at this map and you imagine this territory right here to be filled in with green, because you're confident that when it comes to a vote, the people are going to look at this and vote against slavery. And if that's the case, well then, after the admission of Texas in 1844, essentially the spread of slavery has been halted. There's nowhere else for slavery to potentially expand as a result of this map. So for Northerners, this looks great, right? This looks like a victory. And, the converse is the case too, right? If you're in the South and, you leave this up to popular sovereignty, okay, you concede that California is a free state. There's no really chance of getting that changed. The people of California demand a free state. But you imagine this being filled in with orange. And that is potentially a lot of territory in which slavery could potentially spread to, right? I mean, it's bigger than Texas itself almost, right? It's almost nearly half the country. And then maybe you take into consideration that further territorial acquisitions might be made with Mexico, also potentially adding Caribbean islands, places like Cuba. I mean, it looks pretty good as well. And so you could see why, when this was created, the Compromise of 1850, why Douglas was really celebrated. And it had looked like the nation had, come from the brink of breaking apart to being a united States again. Now, of course, we know, looking back, how the story plays out. But certainly, in that particular time period, it was a huge accomplishment. But that compromise, again, was very much like we mentioned, or it wasn't a very solid truce between the North and the South. I mean, it was a compromise. It's neither what the North or the South wanted. But even again, looking at this map, something that made it different than Missouri was that, once this was made, there's no really territory to argue about, right? So it's like we had talked about this, how it went from, Missouri to Texas to California. Well, everything here's essentially been decided upon. So potentially, where can this issue come up again? And so many believed at the time that this was the last that the nation would ever hear of this issue, that there'd be no more discussion over the expansion of slavery westward, because where else is there potentially to argue? And the answer is there's nowhere, right? But of course, that wasn't the case. Increasingly, the Free Soil Party gained in popularity. Again, we talked about who the Free Soilers were. Gained in popularity. Free Soilers were those who opposed slavery primarily for economic reasons, but they really came to capture the vote of people who opposed it for other reasons, like moral reasons as well. But the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems with the Compromise of 1850, like I mentioned previously, was this new fugitive slave law, right? So what did this new fugitive slave law do? Well, the new fugitive slave law, or the Fugitive Slave Act, created a federal, we'll call it commission, to apprehend or to capture runaway slaves in the North. Right, in the North. So, Fugitive Slave Act created a federal commission to capture. That was very messy. Runaway slaves in the North. So previously, there had actually been a fugitive slave law on the books, but that was written back during the period of the Constitution. So at the Constitution, right, way back 1787 through 89, when northern and southern states came together to create a new government, the conditions for slavery, right, was that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of counting population. However, Northerners feared that if slaves counted towards representation, what prevented Southern states from just importing literally hundreds of thousands of people so they can get more votes in the government. And so part of the Constitutional Convention was a ban on Atlantic slave trade, right? That way, southern states couldn't import more slaves from Africa or from the Caribbean or from Latin America to bump up their representation numbers, right? Southerners said, well, okay, but what if slaves escape, right? Maybe Virginia's a good example here. From Virginia to Pennsylvania. And with a ban on the Atlantic slave trade, what would prevent essentially for all slaves from escaping to northern states? And Northerners said, okay, we will we will pass a fugitive slave. I don't know if it's actually a law. We'll just call it a fugitive slave. I just call it a law. I don't think it's technically a law. Anyways, but there will be a maybe provision, fugitive slave provision. Anyways, Northerners reassured Southern states that if any runaway slaves were to escape, that they would return them. And that was part of this constitutional agreement. However, in the 1840s, throughout the 1850s, states were not abiding by this condition. Northern states said, no, we're no longer going to return runaways. And so this is what the fugitive slave law does, because, again, this is an issue of federalism. All right, we're going to call this a free state, slave state. So let's say a slave runs away from a slave state to a free state. Now, under this provision, right, the fugitive slave, we'll call it a provision, those free states had initially agreed with those states that they would return, right? They're no longer doing that. The new fugitive slave law creates a federal bureau that's going to go into these states and make them return runaways, right? So that's just about the gist of it. What this did, and really what the major consequence of it is, does that make sense anyways? Does anyone have any questions about sort of how that's set up? So again, in the Constitution, it was just an agreement between the states, right? Now free states, now it's a federal bureau, again, not working with any state government in particular, but a separate commission set up in order to return any sort of runaways. So what this did was it brought slavery, and this is probably the most significant part of it, it brought slavery, at least the issue of slavery, to the North. Remember when we talked about the chapter on reforms? And we had said of all the reform movements, like in the North especially, that, if you're living in a northern city and you go outside your home, you see the problem of drunkenness, you see the problem of crime, you see the problem of lack of public education, right? You can visually see those problems in northern cities. But Northerners would never be able to walk outside their homes and see the issue of slavery because it didn't exist. It wasn't right in front of them in northern cities. The Fugitive Slave Law, or the Fugitive Slave Act, changes that, right? Now it creates a federal commission to send people inside northern cities to go and apprehend runaway slaves. And in many cases, accusations were, just kind of thrown out to anyone and everyone. There were people who got arrested by this commission or by this federal bureau, by who Northerners called slave catchers. They called them, in fact, kidnappers, who had never been slaves before. But very little evidence was required. And, hundreds of people were apprehended and captured and sent to the South as slaves. Some people not even being sent back as slaves. You had free black people in the North who had lived as free people their whole lives, whose parents had been free, whose grandparents had been free, who were apprehended by this commission and forced into slavery in the South. And so this was horrific for Northerners, especially. And it brought the issue of slavery to the North in a way that it had never existed before. So like this abolitionist sentiment, which was there in very small numbers, right? You know, your William Lloyd Garrisons, your Harriet Beecher Stowe's, but most people in the North, you know, weren't aware of, you know, like I mentioned before, it was not an immediate issue for most Northerners. The Fugitive Slave Act made it an immediate issue, and you had violent and armed confrontations break out as a result. You know, in Boston, for example, a person who was apprehended by the fugitive slave law was broken out of prison by a riotous mob. And so sort of this constant, again, you know, this compromise 1850 to 1860 for about 10 years, sort of, you know, every once in a while, an occurrence pops up in the North that reminds Northerners of this divide between North and South and of, you know, the institution of slavery. So again, on the outside, the Compromise of 1850, again, was very much a reason to celebrate, but the fugitive slave law was something that only ignited further division between the North and South. Now, after the Compromise of 1850, the issue of slavery really did sort of die down in a lot of ways, at least from the political debate. And one of the other issues that politicians really pushed forward was the completion of a transcontinental railroad. That would be a railroad that went from, we'll say railroad that goes from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. In other words, a transcontinental railroad is just a railroad that goes across the whole country. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of what became priority number one, in a way that politicians almost overlooked the issue of slavery. In fact, they, and Stephen Douglas especially, because he's going to be the one most responsible for this, you know, Stephen Douglas underestimated the importance of the issue of slavery with the American public. And so this issue becomes reignited 4 years later in 1854 over the Kansas-Nebraska controversy, right? Kansas and Nebraska, these are two territories in the United States. And essentially what Stephen Douglas and other members of Congress want to do is they want to make Kansas and Nebraska states to build a railroad. You know, it's a lot more, you know, for a railroad investor, if you're going to build a railroad across the country, you want, you know, you want statehood because there's just a lot more or a lot less risk involved, right? You know, you have certain laws that are on the books that can be enforced. You know what the taxes are going to be. You know, it's a lot less risky. So Douglas and other politicians really want to get this transcontinental railroad done, but one thing that's standing in the way is that Kansas and Nebraska aren't states yet. So maybe we can push Kansas and Nebraska into becoming states a little bit prematurely so we can build the railroad. And that's where this issue of slavery becomes reignited. Because essentially what Stephen Douglas proposes in the form of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is to admit Kansas and Nebraska under popular sovereignty. All right. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is to admit Kansas and Nebraska, two territories, under popular sovereignty. Again, remember this term, what popular sovereignty is. That is to vote on slavery. And this is why the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, is in some cases maybe the most important law in all of American history. In a lot of cases, it's the most consequential legislation in all of American history. And it is, you know, in a lot of ways, in the eyes of many, the most egregious. It eventually did pass Pretty much everybody in the North voted no on it. Everybody in the South voted yes on it. And it barely passed by 3 votes or something like that. So why was this such a big deal for Northerners? Well, I'll show you here in a second. So here we got our map here. This is our Kansas and Nebraska territory. Again, the idea is to build a railroad across here. That was the whole purpose. And in doing so, open this up for popular sovereignty, meaning that there'll likely be a vote, or not that there'll likely be a vote, there will be a vote on slavery. And Stephen Douglas was calculating that, because 2 territories were being created, that it was likely that Nebraska would be voted as free, and Kansas would likely be voted as slave. And that would be like, okay, well, each side gets 1 slave state, each side gets one free state, and there shouldn't be an issue. But the issue is that Kansas, Nebraska was doing something that was fundamentally different than what had happened before. It was different than Missouri, it was different than Texas, and it was different in California. In each of those cases, in Missouri, Texas, and California, the status or legality of slavery prior to those states being admitted to the Union was not concrete, at least in the case of Texas, as where it was an independent republic. A sovereign state can create its own laws. Missouri and California, again, the legality of slavery was determined by legislation in both of those areas. But this area here, right, if you look up at our map here, according to the Missouri Compromise, this was already free soil, right? At least by legislation, by, U.S. government legislation. So whereas before, Missouri, Texas, and California, you can kind of think of them as being kind of all question marks and then either going slave or free, depending on how the admission worked. But Kansas, Nebraska, for the very first time, was taking soil that was already established as free, dating back to 1820. So this was free for 30 years and turning it into slave. And that's where Northerners essentially put their foot down, right? That's why Kansas and Nebraska was so egregious compared to everything else. On top of that, Kansas and Nebraska also overturned the Missouri Compromise. So we'll say this was overturned by Kansas, Nebraska. Again, it was the Missouri Compromise that made Kansas free soil. Again, all the way back in 1820. Let's see if we can identify this line here. Cursor. Missouri Compromise line, right, had made anything above that free soil. That was repealed. It revived the debate over slavery and territories, right? So we'll say about this, the status of slavery / territorial legislature, we'll say the issue was revived. After this, the 2 political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, went through major changes. The Democrats became a party only of the South. The Whig Party ceased to exist, and a new party was created, the Republican Party, and they became the party of the North, right? So the Whig Party, the anti-Andrew Jackson Party, broke apart. All the Northerners essentially left the Democratic Party, joined the new Republican Party. We'll say about the Republican Party, it was the anti-Kansas, Nebraska Party initially, right, is what it was created. Stephen Douglas very quickly went from, hero to zero. Again, this was the guy who just 4 years earlier had saved the country from breaking apart, found a compromise when no compromise could be found, and now here he is 4 years later passing the legislation that revives this once divisive issue. And so all of this essentially led to what's sometimes referred to as the Civil War before the Civil War, and that is Bleeding Kansas. We'll call this the quote-unquote Civil War before the Civil War. As you might imagine, Northerners couldn't pass or couldn't prevent Kansas-Nebraska Act from passing. And so they essentially said, and they quite said this, look, okay, popular sovereignty will be the law in Kansas. We are going to go to Kansas and we are going to fight for free soil. And so Northerners who cared very deeply and very passionately about this issue went to Kansas in order to, in their eyes, stem the tide of slavery. And the same thing was true of pro-slavery advocates. They would go to Kansas in order to vote, in order to extend the rule of slavery there. And, that led to bloodshed. It led to Bleeding Kansas. Pro and anti-slavery forces fighting each other in Kansas. All right, so Bleeding Kansas, we'll go ahead and say pro and anti-slavery violence. Right. When the first votes were held, illegal voting took place. Voters from the nearby state of Missouri we'll say cast pro-slavery votes. So in other words, what happened pretty much was that pro-slavery forces in Missouri crossed over the border, cast a whole bunch of votes, and then went back. And initially when the first vote was held, the pro-slavery forces won. In other words, Kansas was set to become a slave state. The city of Lawrence, which was the, for all intents and purposes, the capital for the free soil advocates, was sieged, quite literally like a battlefield. John Brown, probably the most notorious individual in Bleeding Kansas. He was an anti-slavery, in Lincoln's word, fanatic. And at the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, John Brown and others killed pro-slavery, we'll just call them advocates, killed them with swords at night. And so all of this, right, this is all contributing to Bleeding Kansas, the type of violence that was there. Meanwhile, in the Senate, Charles Sumner, who was a Northerner, Preston Brooks, who was a Southerner. Charles Sumner, about as close to an abolitionist as you can get. He was a senator from Massachusetts, gave a speech called The Crimes Against Kansas. Said a lot of things in that speech. I think it was like 6 hours long or something like that. But essentially just trashed, the South. Preston Brooks was a Southerner who was a member of Congress who believed that his honor had been insulted and proceeded to beat Charles Sumner with a cane. This is sometimes called the caning of Sumner. Right. So we can see by 1854, 1855, we are in a dramatically different place. Right? Things have become explicitly violent. Not only are pro and anti-slavery forces killing one another in Kansas, but quite literally there is members of Congress beating other members in Washington, D.C., where Congress meets. Charles Sumner was beaten into a coma, only to return, I think, like 3 or 4 years later. It was pretty vicious. Preston Brooks was celebrated as a defender of Southern tradition in the South. People sent him canes to celebrate, to replace the one that he had beaten Charles Sumner with. Charles Sumner was viewed as a martyr for Northerners. you know, typically when you look at conflicts, whatever conflict it is, somebody somewhere fires the first shot, right? You know, in a fight, somebody throws the first punch. At a certain point, the violence gets used. And in a lot of ways, Bleeding Kansas was like, the first, even though the Civil War is still 6 years away, it was in some ways kind of like the first example of explicit violence between these two sides that would eventually make up the Civil War. Eventually, federal forces were sent in, reestablished law and order. The president and the Senate recognized the pro-slavery state of Kansas. The House of Representatives said, nope, it was illegal voting, and there needs to be a revote. And for the time being, after all was said and done, the status of Kansas as a state remained in limbo. It wasn't established. So the events surrounding Kansas, Nebraska are very crucial, right, in terms of reviving this issue once again. So any questions about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and its consequences? Okay. So like I mentioned before, again, the reason why Kansas-Nebraska was so egregious was because essentially free soil was being transformed into slave soil. And the idea was that if you could do that in Kansas, you could do that in the rest of the territory, that no free soil essentially was safe. Again, free soilers, for the most part, reject slavery for economic reasons. Slavery leads to little to no job opportunities. And many free soilers were beginning to jump ship into this new party, this Republican Party that was the anti-Kansas Nebraska Party. The pro-slavery argument, we talked a little bit about this before. Some of the reasons that Southerners gave in favor of slavery. Really the only thing that you need to know about the pro-slavery argument was that it was not, people made the argument, but the evidence is very clear in terms of what people chose for all the arguments in favor of slavery, including the infamous positive good argument. I believe this was John C. Calhoun, and it's pretty straightforward, right? Slavery is a positive good. Positive good for the country, but also a positive good for slaves themselves. The bottom line about any argument in favor of slavery is that nobody volunteered to become a slave. It was something that was propped up by force and violence. You can't debate someone into becoming a slave, right, and convince them of that. We also know that in terms of immigration, especially in support of the free soil ideology, that 90% of immigrants moved to free soil. In fact, a lot of people who lived in territories and states where slavery was legal moved to free soil for economic opportunity. Abraham Lincoln, right, born in Kentucky, moved to the free soil state of Illinois, is a good example. The problem of Kansas remains. Again, Kansas. Like I said, the voting took place. It was not recognized by the House of Representatives. Federal troops had to be sent in. James Buchanan is elected president in 1856. All right, he is the U.S. president in 1856. And he goes down as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, more or less, for, it's on his watch that the country more or less falls apart. He shows really what we'll just call a lack of leadership. When it came to the issue of Kansas, he supported the pro slavery, pro-slavery position of Kansas, but again, this was something that was not recognized by the House of Representatives in Kansas. I think I mentioned this last section. Kansas pretty much remains an indeterminate state all the way up until the Civil War begins. In other words, before Kansas can get figured out, the Civil War starts. So it's like, kind of becomes a moot point after that. But all these things are adding more and more and more fuel to the fire as the division over Kansas, or not even over Kansas, but as the division over slavery itself intensifies. I'll just kind of point out here that I think it's supposed to be deadlock, not dreadlock. The deadlock over Kansas. Again, they can't figure out what they're going to do with it. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court makes a decision that will only further divide the North and the South. The Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, as you see right here, Dred Scott was a slave living in free soil. And the question was, should Dred Scott be free? He was a slave servant. He was a slave, but to a U.S. Army surgeon who was stationed in free territory. And Scott resided in that territory. And so abolitionists caught wind of this circumstance, believed that they had a pretty good legal case that because Dred Scott was living in free soil, that he ought to be free. Took a little while for his court to get up, or for his case, to get before the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. Right. Like we mentioned before, on the chapter of the Constitution, members of the Supreme Court are chosen by the president. I think 13 of 16 presidents before, or 13 of the first 16. No, I'm saying that wrong. Of the first 16 presidents, 13 of them, I believe, were either slaveholders or from the South. Right? So like we said before, that 3/5 compromise really gave the South a disproportionate amount of political power, and you saw that reflected in the presidency, and you saw that reflected in the Supreme Court. I mean, Southerners dominated the presidency, and Southerners dominated the Supreme Court. With a few exceptions, you got who, like John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but like besides that, right? Not Abraham Lincoln. That was a significant. We'll talk about why Lincoln's election is important, but. So that meant pretty much everybody on the Supreme Court was in the pro-South position or pro-slavery position. And by the time that Dred Scott's case got all the way to the Supreme Court, it wasn't just, should Dred Scott be free? This is happening in 1857. The question was, does Dred Scott even have the right to sue to begin with? The right to sue because he is a black man. Do Black people in the United States have the right to sue? And the third one was, does Congress have the power to ban slavery? Right? Was that even a power in the Constitution? So the Dred Scott case became a lot more important than just this one guy. It really came to answer a lot of questions about these various topics. Does being a slave living in free territory make you free? Do Black people in the United States have the right to sue or bring their case before the court? And does Congress have the power to prohibit slavery? And on all three cases, Roger Taney and the Supreme Court ruled against Scott on all three cases. So in other words, to answer this question, did being a slave in free soil make you free? No. Did Dred Scott have the right to sue to begin with? The Supreme Court said no. And the implications for this was huge. It went beyond slavery because this went to the point about being a free Black in the United States. It wasn't just about slave and free. This was much more about black and white. And this one, Congress have the power to ban slavery. The Supreme Court said no. And so if you look back at, this image here, right? Essentially what the Supreme Court was saying, that in this territory that's still right here, Congress has no power to prohibit slavery, right? Even in Nebraska. Well, once it's a state, right, states can still do it. But in other words, Congress doesn't have the right to rule that. And of course, the Dred Scott decision really kind of shifted focus back to this particular topic. And it was in this atmosphere that Abraham Lincoln reemerged from politics. Abraham Lincoln, we might say, rejoined politics to oppose Kansas, Nebraska. Something that we didn't mention was that Lincoln was in the House of Representatives when he opposed the Mexican War. He was one of the very few members of Congress, from the North especially, to come out against the Mexican War, and that was because many Northerners understood that this war would lead to the acquisition of more land, and the acquisition of more land would lead to the expansion of slavery. And so whereas most other Northerners were hesitant to come out against the war, because it was, again, everyone was kind of swept up in the nationalistic attitude or aura, you might say. The war cry was American blood was shed upon American soil. I mean, how could one not vote yes on a war like that? And, a handful of members of Congress didn't. I think not many. But Lincoln was one of those people who opposed the war. In fact, he directly challenged the president at the time, President Polk, to show me the spot where the blood was spilled, because he didn't believe that it was legitimate. Now, there was good reason why a lot of other members of Congress and politicians supported the war, because Abraham Lincoln was voted out of office. But, at least it's very interesting to look back on somebody like Lincoln, who, of course, is maybe the most important figure in all of American history, and to see his, kind of political past. And at least early on, 15 years before he becomes president of the United States, he's one of the few people who stood on, kind of the same principle. It's not really that Lincoln's attitude changed. It was that the rest of the country eventually came around to him. And so he re-enters into politics. He had been a lawyer. He had worked with railroad companies. He grew up from a very poor family. Like I mentioned before, I think born in Kentucky, moved to Illinois, a free state, taught himself how to read and write, right, in a time period when not very many people were literate, and made a career in law and politics. And Kansas, Nebraska was, it was that law, again, that a lot of people in the North, that became the final straw, because this was something different. It was taking free soil and it was overturning it. It wasn't just a question about territorial land. It was taking something that had been free for 30 years. It had been free soil. And everyone was confident that it would remain free, and it flipped it. So Lincoln comes out of politics and he challenges. So he runs for Illinois, the Senate seat. He's running for senator in Illinois. And it just so happens that another congressman from Illinois is running against him, and that's Stephen Douglas. And this becomes a national race. I mean, the Lincoln-Douglas, they call him the Lincoln-Douglas debates. All right, 1858. You can see Lincoln debating right here. But Stephen Douglas is the most popular politician in the United States, the most consequential, right? Again, he's suffered a setback because of all the harm that Kansas, Nebraska has done. And he's being challenged by this relatively unknown, funny-looking guy from Illinois. And that was pretty much anybody knew about Abraham Lincoln then. He was tall, he had big hands, big ears, kind of goofy looking. Nothing significant in terms of legislation or anything like that. But he gets up to challenge this guy, Stephen Douglas, who they called the Little Giant, because he was short in stature, but had a very strong political presence, very good at his job, right? And that's getting politicians to vote on legislation. And these debates were only held in Illinois. They were supposed to be only about the state of Illinois, and Illinois is a free state. And so the issue of slavery really should not be the main topic. But every single time that Lincoln and Douglas would get up there, they would always come around to this issue of slavery. And they would debate about Kansas, Nebraska. They would debate about Dred Scott, whether or not they agreed with it. And probably one of the most infamous, maybe Lincoln's most well-known speech, came from these debates, and it was called "A House Divided." And again, Stephen Douglas, if we want to remember Douglas's position, let's see, where is Douglas? That's right here. Douglas's position is compromise, right? Douglas just wants everyone to get along. And, in this speech, Lincoln famously says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. It can't remain," or he said, "it must all become one thing or all become another." Right? A house divided against itself cannot stand. It must become all one thing or all the other. And of course, what is he talking about? In other words, the country can't exist divided on this issue. The United States won't exist. It's either going to become all slave or all free. And, Douglas's response is, well, it's existed half and half until this point. It might as well just exist half and half from here on out. And what Lincoln was able to do in these debates was that, people would pick up the newspaper to read about Stephen Douglas because, again, this guy was... he was an important politician, and they would read about these debates and they say, okay, who's this guy Lincoln? Never heard of him before, but I really like what he has to say. And that was Lincoln's ability to articulate an anti-slavery position that appealed to the masses, right? It wasn't abolitionist. Remember, abolitionists called for the immediate end of slavery, right? End it now, end it everywhere. That's not what Lincoln's position was in the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. It was to stop the expansion of slavery, not compromise on that particular issue. It was to disagree with the Dred Scott decision, right? And one thing that Lincoln did really well in articulating this message was to invoke a lot of those Enlightenment principles, to invoke Thomas Jefferson and say, all men are created equal. And that was a very strong position. Now, ultimately, in this race, Lincoln lost, but became a national figure, right? This was Lincoln's kind of... what you might say his rise to the top, right? People became a lot more familiar with him, and they liked what he had to say, right? Especially, right? An anti-slavery position that appealed to the masses. Two more events here before we get to the dissolution of the United States. John Brown's Raid, 1859. Same John Brown as in Bleeding Canvas. I'm going to write down here because we're running out of room. Led a failed slave revolt in Virginia. John Brown himself, a number of his sons, a number of his allies. I think there were like 20 or 30 people involved. Not very big. Attempted to raid Harper's Ferry, which was an armory, weapons, were captured. John Brown himself was executed. Why John Brown's raid is important is because it really led to the militarization of the South. Remember, the South, they were all in on conspiracies by the North to violently undermine and overthrow slavery. It was only a matter of time, the South believed, that the North would use armed force in order to eradicate and abolish slavery. John Brown was evidence of that, right? And so in response to that armed uprising, although it failed, the South really began this process of militarization, raising armies, drilling, buying weapons. It was the origins and the beginnings of what would become the Confederate Army. But the tipping point was 1860. There was a four-way presidential election. So let's talk about presidential election, 1860. Abraham Lincoln is nominated by the Republican Party. Just so happens that they're holding their convention in Chicago, Illinois. There's a well-known, not really well-known, but he's a more well-known, but, local guy, Abraham Lincoln. Why not, give this guy a shot? At the time, it, really was, Abraham Lincoln had proved that he wasn't really that good at winning elections. He had lost, he was 1 for 3. He had won a House of Representatives, got voted out, and got defeated by Douglas. But they went with him because, again, he had this anti-slavery message that could appeal to a larger portion of the population than someone like, like a William Seward or something like that, who was a lot more, abolitionist. So Lincoln, he becomes the Republican. Oops. Stephen Douglas is running, right? But he is the Northern Democrat. And again, Stephen Douglas's position is just compromise. That's not good. You got a guy, Breckinridge. He is the Southern Democrat. In fact, Breckinridge, again, his position, so we think Lincoln as being the anti-slavery, Douglas being the compromise, Breckinridge is the pro-slavery, and then you have, I think his name is Bell, I forgot his last name, but he is part of the Constitution Party. And this is a party that was brand new, created as an effort to try and bring everyone together. And in this election, Lincoln won, but only won with 40% of the population, and no slave states voted for him. Right? And so with that, once Lincoln got elected in 1860, became the next president of the United States, South Carolina seceded from the Union. That is, South Carolina broke away upon Abraham Lincoln's election, right? And so that election in 1860 becomes the important focal point here. Again, Lincoln's election led to South Carolina seceding or breaking away from the Union. So I'll go ahead and leave it there for today. That's where Chapter 13 ends. Right? Chapter 13 ends with South Carolina leaving, President Lincoln stepping into office, right, to become next president of the United States. And then Chapter 14 covers the Civil War. So a lot of things going on in that chapter. Again, very detailed in terms of the events. I would say pay particular attention to the order in which these crises kind of reveal themselves, right? If you kind of understand, okay, California entering as a free state, led to the Compromise of 1850. Things died down. Kansas, Nebraska reignited that, and sort of understand the narrative behind it. You can kind of keep these things in the proper order. But any questions on chapter 13 then?